Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for spending your really valuable training time here with myself and, more importantly, with our guest today. My name is Zach Taylor. I am also a therapist, and I'm the director of continuing education at Psychotherapy Networker. Which, if you don't know about Psychotherapy Networker, please come check us out. Subscribe to the magazine. Truly the only magazine written for therapists, by therapists, to really tease out the things going on in our consulting rooms. Just a heads up, you're going to get one free continuing education credit from this presentation. At the end of it, you'll be able to click on the yellow, some say orange, you be the judge button in your portal to do the evaluation and receive that certificate. There will be time for questions at the end, so put your questions in the Q&A module inside Zoom here. Hopefully you're very familiar with Zoom after a solid 18 or 19 months of doing this. And if you want to chat, if you just want to say where you're from, what you're hoping to get out of this session today, I think probably one of the most important training sessions I've ever done. Go ahead and chat with each other in the chat as we go. With that, I want to welcome to the, let's call it the Psychotherapy Networker stage, Dr. Craig Bryan. Craig, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah. We are here today to talk about Craig's new book. It's not out yet, but I think it's available for pre-order. It's called Rethinking Suicide: Why Prevention Fails and How We Can Do Better. And I planned to show you that book, but I left it at home this morning. I read it all weekend. But maybe Craig has a copy. I will say I use his manual quite often in my work around suicide prevention. Oh, nice product placement there, Craig. There it is. Okay, right. We have people from all over the world here. Vancouver, South Carolina, Eaton Rapids, Michigan. I'm a Michigander myself. New York, New Jersey, Maryland, and Toms River, New Jersey. Drove through there once. India, Israel. Here they come. Wickenburg, Arizona, probably near the Meadows or at the Meadows Behavioral Health Care. I want to give everybody just a heads up. You should probably know this already, but we're going to talk very frankly and very clearly about suicide. So take care of yourself. This is a big topic. With that, Craig, reading your new book, probably, and I'm not just saying this, probably the best book I've ever read on suicide prevention. It blew my mind. As someone who has faced this personally in his own life, Psychotherapy Networker lost our founding editor to suicide only about 1 year ago. After having suffered from bipolar disorder most of his life. It blew my mind. One of the things reading it, I had no idea you spent so much time in Iraq. as a psychologist with the military, working with soldiers who attempted to take their life. Tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, so that was sort of my entry into the profession. My first gig, so to speak, after complete graduate school was to serve on active duty in the U.S. military. And that was right around the height of hostilities in Iraq. Many people probably remember the surge in Iraq. That was when I was serving. Um, and so, while I was stateside in the United States, I was working at a primary care clinic, kind of doing integrated primary care, but then I deployed for several months to Iraq to run a traumatic brain injury clinic and work at a combat support hospital. And yeah, that definitely, I think, was a transformative life experience for me for many reasons. I think relevant to the topic of suicide prevention is where that was where I really came face to face with what I would say is the brutal reality of suicide. As a psychologist who largely worked, in hospitals and clinics, outpatient side, we contend with suicide often, but if a patient attempts suicide or dies by suicide, it usually happens in their home, it happens somewhere outside of our clinics, our sort of professional domains. But in Iraq, as the only psychologist working in a combat support hospital, when people died by suicide, it was usually firearms, and they were brought to the hospital, and we, cared for their remains. And it was the first time that I really kind of saw the violence, the brutality that suicide can sometimes have. And it was where I started to question a lot of our core assumptions about suicide, because I was repeatedly encountering these cases and situations that just did not fit with what I had been trained to believe and expect about suicide.
I think it's really important people understand you're not just a researcher, but that you have lived through military combat, watching soldiers attempt to take their lives, watching soldiers take their lives. So you have a very unique perspective, not only being a clinician, but one of the most advanced researchers in the world right now on this topic. And you titled your book Rethinking Suicide. I see we've got some soldiers and veterans on this call. So thank you for your service, and thank you for being here. Rethinking suicide. So what do we need to rethink? What's the most important thing that you have rethought that I think that maybe many of us still think?
Yeah, there are probably, I would say, several assumptions in the book that sort of dismantle. Is this correct? Is this really helping us? I think the biggest assumption that I take on, that I definitely encountered, was this notion of suicide being caused by or resulting from mental illness. And the work that I had done as a clinician, I kept encountering all of these instances where people who had attempted suicide, or in some of the cases, the cases, people who had died by suicide, did not necessarily have any obvious indicators of mental illness, mental health conditions. I really kind of feel like we've been barking up the wrong tree for several decades, because I almost kind of feel like we've gotten trapped in this tunnel vision of thinking about suicide nearly exclusively from the perspective of mental health disorders and mental health treatment. And I think it's really caused us to get stuck.
So number one, suicide is not necessarily the result of mental illness.
Yeah, and in the book, I kind of talk about several lines of evidence that support that. And what I find interesting is that you can find a lot of research and data to support this conclusion from decades of work, but it's interesting how it seems like we've largely ignored or not paid attention to the data that were immediately obvious. And so I highlight there's sort of like three kind of main tracks of research findings, one of which is, if you look at epidemiological research here in the US, for instance, we can look at CDC data on annual suicide deaths. And the CDC has fairly consistently reported for years that around half of those who die by suicide do not have a known mental health diagnosis. And now, of course, what I believe for a long time, what many would, I think, similarly believe is that, well, it's just that a bunch of people don't go to mental health treatment, they've not accessed care, therefore they were never diagnosed. So they actually had a mental illness, it just wasn't diagnosed. But when you look at other lines of research, I spent a lot of time talking about Joe Franklin's meta-analysis from several years ago, and you really pay attention to the numbers, what you see is that over and over, we're finding that somewhere around half of those who engage in suicidal behaviors do not seem to fit the bill, do not seem to meet criteria for a mental health condition. And so if that's the case, then that means that there's a lot of people out there that I think we're missing because we are assuming something to be true about them that perhaps is not true after all.
Mm-hmm. You've taken a real critical look at traditional warning signs. As clinicians, we're sort of taught, here's the warning signs that someone's at high risk. You've taken that kind of head on, particularly in the book. Talk about some of the warning signs that we as clinicians may think put a person at very high risk, but actually may not. And some of the warning signs we may not be looking for that you've found through your research and experience that we're not taking a look at closely enough.
Yeah, I would say that when we look at the typical warning signs that are, disseminated for public consumption, most of them involve mental health related concepts, depression, hopelessness, irritability, things like that. And in some cases, those themes, those warning signs are not necessarily able to be directly observed. So, like, what does depression look like? And it's hard to really kind of pin that down. And I think actually there's been some interesting in the past several years, more public health awareness showing people, like this is what depression looks like. And the person, smiling is happy because they're kind of concealing it, right? So one of the problems with warning signs is that, number one, they typically involve mental health concepts. And those concepts oftentimes are internal to the person. We can't see them, we can't touch them, we can't feel them. And so it makes it a lot harder for us to accurately and reliably detect. The second issue is that a lot of the warning signs that we rely on are very common and oftentimes are not specific to suicide. And so I do focus on suicidal ideation as one particular warning sign that we have long kind of pronounced as this is a really, really important warning sign, the most important. We need to take action immediately. And I sort of break down the numbers around this. But in essence, what we know is that around 99% of those who experience thoughts of suicide will not attempt suicide or die by suicide. And so we make this sort of mistake. There's this fallacy that I talk about, the inverse probability fallacy, where we look at studies and say, well, 50% of those who died by suicide said that they wanted to kill themselves. They reported suicidal ideation. Whoa, that's a really strong relationship. But what that also means that 99% of those who think about suicide do not engage in suicidal behaviors. And so even something like suicidal ideation, oftentimes, it's sort of like most of the time people are not going to actually proceed to suicidal acts. And I think we lose track of those probabilities, and it can lead to distorted assumptions about the meaningfulness, the utility of different warning signs. And I think the last thing I'll say about this is just, I think what that often does is it lends to a better safe than sorry and overreaction approach, which is where perhaps this leads us as clinicians to recommend higher levels of care, more restrictive, more coercive treatment options that maybe aren't indicated simply because we have these distorted understandings or assumptions about the role of warning signs and their predictive utility.
So I just want to be clear. You're saying that suicidal ideation is maybe not as important of a warning sign for actual risk as we've maybe come to believe. I just want to clarify that.
Yeah, I think it's. I would say it's a weaker correlate than what we often assume.
I see.
Yeah. And I think, something else that, a lot of, I think, clinicians aren't aware of is that there's also sort of an assumption of like a progression of suicide risk. A person starts with, say, like depression, then they start feeling like they don't want to live anymore, they want to die, and then they proceed to, I'm going to kill myself, and then they proceed to making a plan, and then they attempt. But what we find is that there's a lot of people who skip some of those in between stages. And we now are seeing more and more evidence that there might actually even be some people who move very rapidly from a non-suicidal state to a very high risk state, and they attempt suicide. And so it appears as though they attempted without any suicidal ideation at all. And so I think what it comes down to is that the way that we have defined suicidal ideation, the way that we think about it clinically, oftentimes is not the full picture. It's sort of like we're too narrow in our assumptions about the role of suicidal thinking and how it relates to suicidal actions.
Yeah, I'm sure, probably many are thinking this. Well, Craig, then what do we do when someone reports I'm having suicidal ideation? And I want to get to that. But first, I want to just getting into this assessment and warning signs a little bit deeper. I know a lot of clinics and agencies are relying heavily on the PHQ-9. That's the Patient Health Questionnaire, 9-question PHQ-9. And the last question on there asks about thoughts of suicide. You reported in your book, tell me if I'm misquoting you, that many who die by suicide report having no suicidal thoughts recently. Right. I think speaking to what you just said, can you unpack the relevancy of the PHQ-9 to actual suicide risk, and particularly around that last question?
Yeah. So this is a common question, and I field this question all the time from clinicians. I see it on listservs. But what's the best way to screen for risk? What's the best method? And the reality is that when you look at the research, and Pete Gutierrez, for instance, has done some really great research on this in the past several years, where they did head-to-head comparisons of like different screening tools. What they found is that pretty much all methods of screening or assessing suicidal ideation are just as good or just as bad as any other one. And so I one of the things that I've increasingly been worried about is that a lot of systems of care have moved away from like the PHQ-9 to adopt more comprehensive, longer, sometimes more expensive screening methods, but it's not really changing anything. And I think it's because, again, we have this assumption that this is sort of like the gateway. People have to go through suicidal ideation to get to suicidal behavior, and that might not be true for everyone. And we can ask someone, are you having thoughts about suicide, in lots of different ways, but pretty much we keep getting just the same result. About half say no, and then they attempt suicide. And I think what it comes down to is that it reflects something about suicidal thinking that defies assessment, that defies our typical ways of understanding and measuring it. And so when I get asked, well, what should we change to? What should we use instead of the PHQ-9? I usually shrug my shoulders and say, I actually don't think changing things will meaningfully improve detection, because you're just asking the same question using different language. You're not fundamentally changing the screening or assessment approach. And so let's not delude ourselves into thinking that just swapping out one ideation item or scale for another one is going to like drastically meaningfully improve things overall. So it's sometimes seen as kind of like a cynical approach, but I really think it's actually the empirically supported approach. And what that means is that clinicians, I think, have a lot more flexibility when it comes to screening and assessment. And it's just key for us to recognize that there are these intrinsic limitations. You will have some patients who are suicidal and are not going to tell you for multiple reasons. But also the other issue is that the way that we're asking about it is not how they are experiencing suicidal ideation. So they're being honest with us. We're just asking the wrong questions. And then I think the third possibility as well is at the time that we ask them, they are not thinking of suicide.
Right.
It sometimes changes very rapidly. And so they are being honest, and right then and there, they are not having thoughts of suicide, and then things change. And they move very quickly to a high-risk state.
I think there's a sense, and maybe this is just me, but that clients are being evasive when they say they're not, and then they go on to attempt suicide or die by suicide. And what I'm hearing you saying is, no, maybe it's just they don't experience suicidal ideation in the way you're asking, or in the way you're engaging with them, or in the way the assessments ask.
Yeah, I do. I think that is sort of the default setting for many clinicians. Well, they're just concealing, they're hiding it from us. And I do suspect there are some patients, and research does support that. There are some patients who say, no, I'm not telling my clinician therapist because I don't want to be hospitalized. I'm afraid they'll freak out. I don't trust them. And so it does happen. But there's also a large group of patients who are denying because, again, they just at that moment are not actually experiencing suicidal thoughts, or we're not asking them we're not using the right language. We're not actually capturing the nature of their phenomenology. And so like Richards, I talk about a study by Richards, that's what she found, was that there are a lot of patients who basically said the question didn't actually map onto my experience. So I said no, because that was the honest answer.
Let's get into a little bit of how you talk to patients, clients about suicidal risk. So, but one question that comes up all the time is hospitalization. And I think we got to just get this out of the way. Talk about hospitalizing clients or sending them to the hospital to be hospitalized, who the clinician has decided are high risk. Is hospitalization helpful?
So I think it can be for some patients, and under certain circumstances. And so definitely, I think the challenge that most clinicians face is that there is sort of this, I think assumption that hospitalization is the best option. It's the gold standard. It's the highest level of care. I really think that's, kind of a historic perspective, but I also think it's largely driven by anxieties around litigation. And so I think we have the better safe than sorry approach, because it's better to hospitalize just in case. But there is a subset of patients who experience hospitalization as aversive, understandably so. Your freedoms are taken away, a lot of your autonomy is taken away. For some patients as well, it's it results in a significant financial burden afterwards. It can be stigmatizing. And so, I think we need to be a lot more intentional and deliberate about when is it most appropriate to use hospitalization. And to be perfectly honest, we don't have a whole lot of clear scientific data to back that up. But I will say, some of the work that I've done on like legal consulting with, like forensic malpractice negligence cases where I've been asked to come in to review and render an opinion. It is fairly typical for lawyers to charge the clinician with not doing enough. You should have hospitalized. And a lot of times experts like me and there are others come in and say, no, it wasn't appropriate to do that. But I think nonetheless that's a lot of pressure, I think, from the system. And I think it helps to explain why clinicians have that anxiety and feel compelled to recommend hospitalization, even though it's probably not going to be all that helpful for the majority of situations.
Sure. There's a lot more myths and rethinking that you do in the book that, frankly, we've only got an hour here that we could go into. I know all of you are just like I am. So what do we do instead, Craig? Help us. We have people who may see suicidal clients this afternoon. So in the effort to make this as practical, as engaging as possible, let's talk a little bit about how you actually engage with clients who experience suicidality. How do you language those questions? Let's start at the beginning in asking them about suicide in a way that will be most likely to elicit sort of an honest experience.
Sure. So one of the lines of research that we've been working on is, kind of as a follow-up before, that a lot of people who attempt suicide will not report suicidal thoughts. And so we've been trying to develop new ways to capture high-risk states that don't rely on suicidal ideation. So we use one of the scales we've developed is called the Suicide Cognition scale. Actually, a new study just came out yesterday in the Annals of Family Medicine, showing it improved suicide risk screening. But it's basically a self-report scale that was based off of the lived experience of suicidal patients. It's statements, I can't take this anymore. I can never be forgiven for the things that I've done. People would be better off without me. And so we've started to use that at the time of intake as another way of assessing risk. And that often provides a nice bridge for breaching that question, because one of the things I look for is if someone is endorsing a lot of these beliefs, but they're saying they're not actively suicidal, in my head, I'm still thinking they're vulnerable, right? So maybe, I don't know, maybe they're not actively suicidal right now, but they're definitely in a vulnerable state. And so I can then gear the assessment towards, I notice that you believe that the world would be better off without you, or that you kind of feel like you just can't handle this pain any longer. Tell me more about that. And then that oftentimes opens the door, because what we hear from patients, part of the reason they like this approach is that they kind of feel like, how did you know what I was saying to myself? And it was, well, we listened to patients and we just kind of wrote it down, and then we gave it to other patients and said, do you feel this way too?
So this is all in the suicide cognition scale?
Yeah, the suicide cognition scale.
So you got some of the things from that scale, just listening to how patients describe their experience and then putting it in a scale. Is that available to clinicians? Okay.
Yeah. So it's currently in the public domain. And so clinicians can email me. We can provide like Microsoft Word versions of it, and you can use it within your clinical practice.
And this is something you recommend as a way of opening the door to the conversation around suicidality with clients?
Yeah, we found it very helpful. So that way it gives us sort of an inside look under the hood. What's going on inside this person's world, right? Because again, the suicidal ideation, these like thoughts of ending your life, are very narrow. It's very specific. And there are all these other thoughts that surround suicidal ideation. And so if someone is willing to endorse, I'm thinking of killing myself, great, we can kind of move right into it right away. And I usually say, tell me more about that. What do you say to yourself? What are the images you see in your mind?
Mm.
But if not, this sort of all these other items kind of give us that sort of phenomenology and say, man, it sounds like you're really hurting right now, and help me understand your perspective. And we do what's called a narrative assessment approach, which is kind of common to brief cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention. CAMS uses this, but it really is this open-ended, patient-centered assessment approach, where instead of doing a suicide risk assessment interview, like most of us were trained, I used to do trainings like this, like here's a form, ask a bunch of questions about risk factors.
Mhm.
What we do instead is we just change the dynamic, and we just ask the patient, tell me the story about your crisis. How did you get from point A to point B? And we collect all the same information. We get all the risk factors. It's just that now it's, from the patient's perspective, we've been able to show it actually increases their sense of feeling heard, understood. We get better empathy ratings.
It's so important.
Yeah,
So-
absolutely. It does
so-
open the door.
So you use the suicide cognition scale as a way of sort of opening the door in that narrative way. When you're listening to that narrative and you're asking, tell me about the story, tell me about the crisis, what was happening for you? What are those warning signs you're looking for and listening for in the narrative? Because I totally agree with you that the interrogation that we call a suicide interview is alarming. I would not. Someone in the chat I saw said, a colleague of theirs, also a fellow therapist, died by suicide. Just never got help because they wanted to avoid these kinds of things in hospitalization. So what you're talking about is this open-ended narrative assessment, which I imagine would scare some of us on this call of, ooh, but I don't get a score at the end that tells me what to do. What?
Yeah.
But you're saying you can get the same information in a much more person-centered way through narrative assessment.
Yeah.
So what are you listening for in that narrative that truly speaks to risk?
So what we typically will listen to, so in that story, and for clinicians on the joining in who have been trained in like more behavioral approaches, you would recognize this as like a chain analysis or a functional analysis, where we kind of look at the sequence of thoughts, feelings, behaviors, contextual factors that lead up to the crisis. And what I'm listening for are what happens in the moments that lead up to that intensification of risk. Perhaps it's things that a person said to themselves, I can't take this anymore. My life is worthless. I'll never amount to anything. Sometimes it's behaviors that they engage in. They might pace. They feel tense. They get sick to their stomach. And we help then the patient to recognize that, to say, these are your personal warning signs. These are your indicators that things are getting overwhelming. And again, a lot of these things are just manifestations of like emotional reactivity, right? We get tense when we're stressed out. We clench our jaws, we pace, but there's a personalization to the patient. And then we help them to identify what's different about that experience or warning sign on the day that you almost killed yourself or really wanted to, as compared to all the other days. We have a demonstration video we use in a lot of our trainings, where there's a patient who's basically saying, well, I get sick to my stomach, but it's not like I ate something bad. It's like anxiety sick to my stomach. And so the clinician then said, let's put that down, because it's anxiety sick to your stomach. And that's different from, yeah, I just had a meal that didn't sit well with me. And although in many ways, in many respects, it's like, what does that mean? I don't know. But to that patient, that means everything. It totally resonates with them. And that is how we can help them to better identify their high risk states and what they can do to manage their reactions.
So I want to ask you for an example of that, because it sounds very gooey. You're talking, there's personal risk factors. Well, how do I know this is a risk factor for that person, but maybe not that person? So I want to ask you maybe for a quick example. But before we get mobbed in the chat here, people are asking for really where to find the suicide cognition scale, and where they can maybe get a little bit more training on your style of
Oh,
brief
okay.
cognitive brief cognitive behavioral therapy, or BCBT for suicide, and then your crisis response planning trainings.
Yeah. Yeah. So in terms of the assessment tool, usually people shoot me an email. I don't know if there's maybe an easier way to, it looks like there's 700 people on today. I don't know if there's a central location where maybe we could post it for people
Yeah.
to download. I'm certainly happy to do that.
Okay.
And then in terms of other trainings, yeah, people can reach out to me. We have, just a training company that we, signed up. Now, I will say right now, we primarily only do the trainings for like agencies who can like contract with. We have a whole bunch of people we want to train. We're looking into options for like just individual clinicians to sign up as a group in a community setting. And so hopefully we'll be able to put something together for that in the near future.
Great. And everybody on the call. So this was a little bit more of a live Q&A. So we will get a link for you and put it in your portal where you accessed this training, and where you're going to access your evaluation. Give us some time today, and we'll get that material from Craig. So let's keep going down this road here. Give us a little bit of an example of a conversation you had with someone and you did that chain analysis that was specific to them.
Yeah, I had, there's one case that comes to mind from several years ago that I met, where it was a young Hispanic male who was serving in the military. And basically his story was that his wife was out of town, was visiting family. And while she was visiting family, she had some sort of like a conflict or negative interaction with her father, which is kind of a historical thing for them. And so she called the patient and said, here's what's going on. And in essence, the patient said, your dad's like this. He's always been this way. I told you not to go visit, but you didn't listen. And so, of course, perhaps that was not the most effective response for the patient, but it escalated. They get into an argument. And during the course of the argument, at one point, the wife says to him, you never listen. Like, this is why you're not a good husband. This is why you're not a good father. This just is upsetting to me. And for him, his identity as a father is sort of core to who he is. So when his wife said, you're not a good father, that was sort of the trigger. That was the activating moment. And he got angry. He felt guilty. He felt ashamed. And he started having all these thoughts of, I'm not a good person. I should just end it. I'll do them all a favor. And so he went, grabbed a shotgun, and sat in the family room contemplating whether or not he's going to kill himself. And it was actually what kind of snapped him out of the moment was his dog came up and started licking his hand. And so in that story, we got all this information about relationship, conflict, some predisposing vulnerabilities in his past, his emotional reactions, his thought processes. And so it provided us this different picture, as opposed to me asking, how long did you think about suicide? What did you think about? Did you have a plan? Did you have access to methods? What was that method? Do you feel hopeless? And he would have probably given me a lot of that information the same, but it wouldn't have, I think, just gelled together in this coherent story. And so once we had this timeline, we could then say, now we can see how this fits within your life as an individual. And now from a treatment planning perspective, we need to kind of look at, why is this whole I'm not a good father? That's a real vulnerability point for you. And we should probably work on that therapy. And we should probably also look at other ways to respond to stressful, upsetting, unexpected events, so that instead of going and grabbing the gun and thinking about ending your life, You can go for a walk, you can do breathing exercises. There are all these other things that can help calm you back down. And he found that to be incredibly helpful. And that was, in essence, how the treatment process started.
It's a really good example, because I think some of the more in maybe I'm being pejorative here, but interrogative interviews, do you have a plan? What is it? What is it? What is it? As important as those might be, and today we only have a short time. So we're just introducing this idea that really one of the real experts here and researchers and clinicians on this is saying to us to consider this more narrative-based chain analysis approach toward getting the very important information around suicidal risk. And it was a beautiful example there that you just gave, that hopefully will begin. I know a lot of you in the chat are saying, hey, my agency makes me do this and the institutions make me do that. I hear you. I think Craig hears you as well. This is, I think, though, a step in the right direction.
Yeah, we hear that all the time when we're doing trainings. And so a big part of it is sometimes helping clinicians reconcile agency or institutional requirements for documentation with this patient-centered approach. And what I usually find when we do this is that the institution requires certain methods of documentation, like we have to fill out this form, or we have to fill out this template within the system. But usually it's not the case that the agency is saying, you must ask these particular questions using these exact words. We just need you to take note of these issues. And when that's the case, I think it's helpful for clinicians to distinguish between, well, the form and the paperwork is not the intervention. That's just the tool that you use to document your clinical contact. And so we actually have some latitudes of freedom to change the dynamics of that interaction. And then it sounds like your agency wants you to fill out these forms, things like that, which then meets their administrative requirements. And so that's usually the case. And hopefully that's kind of a way of kind of distinguishing how to balance these two competing demands.
Great. All right, everyone. So we're going to do Q&A here. Your questions are piling up in the Q&A module. Thank you for doing that. If you want to ask a question, check out to see if your question's already sort of been asked, and then upvote or give a thumbs up to that question. And then if it's not there, go ahead and add it to the module. Don't forget, at the end of this, you'll be able to get one CE if you do the evaluation once we're done and you've attended the entire the entire session. Craig, we've put your email in the chat, so just get ready for that deluge. And we will be getting some materials from Craig to put into your portal where you access to this and where you'll also access the video from this. So just a little housekeeping there real quick. Before we get to Q&A, one more question. You talked about the narrative approach, based in BCBT, or brief cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention. I had to get all that out. And asking about the crisis. But you bring up something else in your book, I think, that's equally important. You're a big advocate for asking about times they were in crisis that they did not attempt to take their life. Yeah. Why is that such an important question as well?
Yeah, so it basically provides clues as to what we can actually do to help the patient, but also I think it helps the patient to reframe their experience, because one of the hallmarks of the suicidal crisis is tunnel vision. And so many of us as clinicians hear from patients things like, I was overwhelmed, I just can't, nothing would work, things like that. And so one question that I found it very helpful to ask is like, well, what did you do all of the other times that you were having thoughts of suicide and feeling overwhelmed, but did not try to kill yourself? And it's really helpful, I think, especially for like patients who are recurrently suicidal, who have made multiple attempts, or they have these sort of just persistent suicidal thoughts. to help them to realize that just because you have the thoughts doesn't mean you have to act upon it. And actually, in most cases, 99% of the time when you experience the stress, these overwhelming feelings, you do not attempt suicide. And so let's learn from your own experience, learn from your strengths, so that we can maybe empower you to recognize that and then apply that knowledge to some of these other, the smaller percentage of the time where it's harder for you to kind of remember what to do.
Right. Along those lines, I believe we have Donald Meichenbaum on this call. I don't know if you know Don, but I think it's the Don we're all thinking about. But asking the client, he asked about the client's dog licking their hand, and saying, was your follow-up question? What was it about the dog licking your hand that caused you to change directions?
Yes.
Is that sort of where you went?
Yeah. And so, the way that we approach this in BCBT is after the narrative assessment, we then usually pivot. We do some brief psychoeducation where we introduce what's called the suicidal mode, which is a case conceptualization model. And then we move immediately into crisis response planning, which is the first intervention. And there's a section of the crisis response plan that's focused on reasons for living. And so that's typically, as we move to that stage, what was it about? What was it about your dog licking your hand that changed things for you? And so another question that I do find myself asking a lot with patients as they're telling their narrative is I'll ask them, like, how long did you do that? And I find it really helpful, especially when they are at that moment in the story where they say, well, sitting on the bed, basically with everything I needed to kill myself. And I sat there for a few minutes, and then I tried to kill myself. And then I'll kind of back them up. Well, you said you were there. How many minutes were you sitting on the bed not killing yourself before you tried to kill yourself? And then I zoom in on that brief window of time, and then say, well, what was going on in your head during that moment? And that's usually where we see that, well, I was thinking about my kids, I was thinking about family, something like that. And for that particular case that I described, the dog, for him, it was the tactile sensation of the licking that he said it snapped me out of it. It brought me back into reality. And so actually one of his interventions on his crisis response plan was taking his dog for a walk, because for him, we kind of talked about how the dog now almost sort of like embodied this life, and his dog saved him. And so I was like, well, let's make sure we reward the dog and let's strengthen your relationship with the dog. I'm glad you listened to him.
Craig, we're going to get into Q&A here. I think people got some great questions. Again, keep up voting those questions you want to hear from Craig. Just so everyone knows, this is really new stuff at Psychotherapy Network, where we try to stay on the cutting edge. So if you actually know something cutting edge, let us know. What are we not looking at? But Craig is doing some incredible work at Ohio State, the Ohio State, which being someone who went to University of Michigan, this is actually something we can connect over this training. Which is good. There are bridges even between a Wolverine and a Buckeye. But that said, this is really, really new stuff. Craig and his colleague, Justin Baker, who's also an amazing psychologist, put together a 2-day training on brief cognitive behavioral therapy for suicide prevention, as well as a training on crisis response planning. These are incredible trainings, but as he said, they're mostly doing them for agencies right now because of time. But realizing there's a huge demand, they are going to be doing these trainings with Psychotherapy Networker in the near future, I think. So stay tuned, stay in touch with us. Hopefully the full training, and that's really not what today was about, but I thought it was worth mentioning since so many are asking. Those trainings are coming for the first time to the masses through Psychotherapy Networker in early 2022-ish. Okay. Let's go to Q&A here. Thanks everybody for sticking around. So Katie asks that a lot of your research is around veterans. Does it apply to other demographics, ages, races, and genders? Anything you can speak to there?
Yeah, it does. I think specific to the treatment, I like to highlight that, for instance, Greg Brown published a cognitive therapy for suicide prevention protocol in 2005, and that was done with non-veterans, I think it was like 60% women. It was a good racially diverse sample as well, and they found nearly the exact same results. And then more recently, Mark Signor up at the University of Toronto basically took our BCBT protocol and adapted it for a younger population with adolescents and young adults. They published results, saw significant reductions in suicide attempts as well. And we were doing more research now to better answer the question, but all signs point to that it does work with different patient groups.
Got it. Nick asks about litigation. How do we protect ourselves as clinicians? Is there something you could just point to, that something we can put in our documentation, something we can do that should the worst happen, we know we've done the right thing and we've documented it well?
Yeah. I don't think there's any one thing you can do, because I will say one thing that I've learned as I've done more and more consulting in this space is that no matter what we do, lawyers will find something that we didn't do and will make a bigger deal out of it than what it actually is. And so a big part of it, to be perfectly honest, is making sure your own lawyer calls in a good expert who can put things in a perspective. Now, having said that, one thing that I think we underappreciate, that we don't do yet enough of in the profession, is really talk about the risks associated with treatment at the very beginning during the informed consent process. So there's actually a wonderful paper written, it's been several years now, maybe a decade, by David Rudd, Greg Brown, Thomas Joyner, Dave Jobs, like all the big hitters in suicide prevention research. But it talks about informed consent specific to suicide risk. And we include sections in our informed consent documentation about the risks associated with therapy. And one of the risks is suicide attempts. And what a lot of clinicians don't realize is that if someone starts therapy, if they've been discharged from an inpatient unit and you're like the follow-up outpatient plan and they've attempted suicide, there's actually something like a 40 to 50% chance that they're going to attempt suicide within the first year of therapy. If someone attempts suicide while in therapy, they're like very highly likely to make a second suicide attempt. And so we include that in patient information, handouts, informed consent up front, in the same way that if you think of like other health disciplines, if you do surgery, get some procedure done, they say, here's the risks of death, of, permanent disability, things like that.
Very interesting.
Yeah. And so what many lawyers have conveyed to, especially Skip Simpson, who does a lot of work in the space, he says that that's a big part of foreseeability, is in essence being direct and honest with patients up front. And in essence, what we do with our very, very high risk patients is say, death is a likely outcome. Well, not a likely outcome, but death is a possible outcome. And here's how we're going to manage your risk within the context of this treatment, because we cannot eliminate risk completely. But ideally, if we use proper procedures and empirically supported treatments, we can reduce the probability of an outcome. So definitely stick up with all of the stuff you've already learned, good assessment, good documentation. My guess is that might be one area that you could add that actually doesn't, I think, impede a lot on your practice, which is good. Just kind of embed that a bit more explicitly at the informed consent process.
Excellent. I think you mentioned a paper with Thomas Joyner and David Rudd on informed consent.
Yes.
Do you happen to know the name of that paper?
The title is something like, I think it may just be informed consent with high risk patients, like the risks in and out of treatment or something like that. I'd have to look it up.
trying to keep up with all the great information, as I know everybody on this call is trying to. You'll also be able to rewatch portions of this as you'd like in your portal. So there's a
Robbie
little.
just put it in the chat box. Informed consent with
Ah,
suicidal patients, rethinking risks in and out of treatment. And you know it's going to be a great paper if it has
thank you.
rethinking in the title. So
Thank you, Robbie, for putting the title of that paper. For those who don't see the chat, who are just watching this as a replay, it's called Informed Consent with Suicidal Patients, Rethinking Risks in and Out of Treatment. Okay, good, very good. Just so you know, also, I did a program last year with Craig, as well as many others. There's a module in there on documentation for suicide risk. I think that module was very good. It was with Bert Bertram and an attorney, Nancy Wheeler, who's done this most of her career. I think it's the last module of that program is with Psychotherapy Networker. I think Maddie just posted Maddie is our wonderful tech host in the background. She just put that in the chat if you do want to check it out. Next question. The Columbia scale. I saw this question several times. Could you just make a comment about your opinion on the Columbia scale?
yeah, I think it's, I was sort of indirectly referring to it before. I think it's just as good or just as bad as any other scale. And, so I think there's a big movement to adopt it. I think the purported superiority of the Columbia relative to other tools is overstated. And so I would say pick a scale that works for your system, that works for your patients and your clinicians. That's the most important. What makes sense to them, what's acceptable to them. I do worry a little bit that I have encountered a mindset that's sort of like, oh, if we adopt this, we'll be doing much better. And it's like, not necessarily. And I worry that maybe it's giving a false sense of security to agencies and clinicians. So just pick a scale that, works for your setting and for your patients.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Rachel, and I see someone actually put a link to the paper in the chat. So thank you for doing that. I think it was Nancy and maybe others. Anything, I think Rachel asks, I'm going to change the question a little bit, Rachel. Are there any differences in working with elders or children from what you've said to us so far? Any other caveats we should keep in mind?
Yeah, I think there are some developmental differences. Some of my experiences working with older patients, for instance, is that I think sometimes their suicidal ideation or their thoughts of death may, I think, be different subjectively because they're at a different point in the lifespan. And so they have a different relationship with death, a different understanding of life. And so we've definitely seen this. We've done some preliminary stuff with particularly end of life issues. Greg Brown has found that, for instance, CBT doesn't seem to work as well with older patients. And I think one of the reasons might be is that suicidal ideation, as we have conceptualized it, maybe isn't the same when you know that maybe you're probably going to die soon anyway. Maybe you have serious health conditions, things like that. So I do think that maybe we need to be mindful of just what does it mean to be suicidal when you're at a stage of your life where there's a different relationship or different recognition or understanding of death. And then earlier on in the developmental trajectory, I think, again, that suicidal ideation or thoughts of suicide may be expressed or experienced in different ways for children who, whether because they don't necessarily have the verbal development yet to express it, but I think this is where our work with the suicide cognition scale suggests that maybe suicidal thinking is a broader concept than what we've traditionally assumed. And I find that in particularly the work that I do with adolescents, older adolescents, that definitely seems to be the case. They resonate more with these other ways of measuring and assessing their thoughts as compared to the more explicitly, are you thinking of ending your life? So.
Of course. Um, Make a comment about safety contracts. I think Wendy asked this question versus safety plans. What's your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so we definitely want to avoid no suicide contracts, and there are different words for that. There's agreements, pacts, contracts, things like that.
Mhm.
We also want to avoid contracting for safety, the whole "can you keep yourself safe if I let you go home?"
Mhm.
We actually published a study showing that crisis response planning is better than that. But we also have seen from the lived experience perspective that a lot of patients just don't like it. It's seen as coercive. They know, right? They know what the right answer is to something like that. Can you make this commitment to me? There's a right answer and a wrong answer. It's super obvious, and it's often experienced as a way for the clinician to protect themselves as opposed to doing something in the interest of patients. So another paper written by David Rudd, again, was the case against no suicide contracts that was published in 2006. And a really nice articulation of why we should probably immediately stop doing contracts, pacts, agreements, and adopt instead crisis response planning or safety planning, which is kind of the latest iteration of crisis response planning.
Got it. Craig, you've covered so much ground. You've given us a ton of resources, the suicide cognition scale. You've mentioned 3 or 4 papers, I think, ways to get more training. You've given people your contact information, which is very generous of you. I hope everyone who was on this call got at least a taste. It was a quick hour. It went at least quickly for me. Sometimes sitting in your office with lots of distractions, maybe a little slower. But thank you all for coming. This is such a hugely important topic. Thank you for sticking around. We're going to end this session in just a moment. If you would like to receive up to 1 CE, I believe we got most professionals approved for this. Click the yellow, or some people call it orange, I think I call it orange button, where you accessed this training. It'll take you right to the evaluation and you'll get your certificate. The recording of this will also be there on demand for you in your account with Psychotherapy Networker. And I just encourage you to stay tuned. Check out Craig's book when it comes out, Rethinking Suicide. He's already got a wonderful workbook out on BCBT, which I have here, which was co-authored with David Rudd. Very useful workbook. I think it gets deeper into what I think Craig mentioned, the suicide mode and crisis response planning. It does have some of those things in the back of the kinds of worksheets that, I know this looks like an advertisement, but I just really enjoy this. It's got some of the things that he does and that he and David Rudd have done research around. Thank you all again for being here, being a part of Psychotherapy Networker. We are a very large tribe as a professional family. So please stay connected with us. And Craig, thank you so much for doing this today. We'll see you all next time.